Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And it's a Monday morning at 11 a.m. on the East Coast of the United States in a little place we call Mystery Island, where I have set up this studio over the past 4.5, 5 years now with your help, with donations you make to my Patreon, and I do appreciate it. And, so we keep on going. And we've been reading books here on Monday mornings, and I'm going to keep on reading The Paperclip Conspiracy by Tom Bauer. Um, we've talked about Operation Paperclip since the beginning of my show. We first learned about it, through Fletcher Prouty and through uh, Annie Jacobson's book, which came out during the time I think I was just starting my show. But the idea that there was a previous book published in Great Britain in 1987, which takes a different attitude and a different line of research into the issue, I think it's really worth looking into, especially when we consider the findings we've been making concerning uh, trading with the enemy, business as usual, the corporations working together in an economy of their own outside of the economy that you and I live by, a way of really dividing and conquering gradually the whole world, and doing that through malicious, awful, uh, inhuman methods, as we will read about today. The effort of the Americans at that time is driven by a man named Holger Toftoy. And I thought that is such a strange name. I've got to know more about it. Toftoy. So I wanted to read a little bit from his Wikipedia so you can understand who he is as we talk about him in the book. Um, this is the Wikipedia article. And let's see, maybe I could even share that screen since we're all friends here. Sure, why not? Okay, Holger Toftoy, Major General. That's 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 a big that's a high office. Major General Holger Nelson Toftoy, dates October 1902 to April 1967. So he only lived to be 65 years of age. Was a U.S. Army career officer instrumental to the development of the U.S.'s early rocketry after World War II, such as the Redstone missile. He persuaded senior officers to bring German scientists to the U.S. after the war. That's why I named this part 7 of the book after him, Toftoy, because it's his thing. In 1952, he was appointed to direct the Ordnance Missile Laboratories at Redstone Arsenal near Huntsville, Alabama. By 1958, he was Deputy Commanding General of the Army Ordnance Missile Command, Redstone Arsenal. Later that year, he was reassigned as Commanding General of Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. 2 years later, he retired because of health issues and moved to Florida, where he got to go fishing. Operation Paperclip. While working at the submarine mine depot, Toftoy oversaw the development and design of a new system of controlled submarine mines that was used during World War II. In 1944, he became chief of the Army Ordnance Technical Intelligence Teams assigned to Europe to seek and evaluate captured enemy ordnance weapons and equipment. During this time, Toftoy received a request from Colonel Gervais Trichel, Trichel, chief of the rocket branch in the Ordnance Department at the Pentagon, to acquire and ship 100 operational V-2 rockets to the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico for testing. Soon after the Allied capture of the areas around Nordhausen and the Mittelwerk, Toftoy set up Special Mission V-2 to do the job. All right. The other interesting point is that when they shipped these missiles to the United States to go to White Sands, they shipped them to New Orleans first. Just always interesting to see New Orleans get prominent place in the chain of things, a chain of events. Okay, let me move back to the book now and get into the text of that. Okay, hello, Polly, and hello, Corky, and hello, everyone who is watching now live or will be watching in the future on a replay. I think this these excerpts of this book are very helpful in understanding the psychological change from "we hate Nazis" to "we love them for their science." Very strange thing. Okay, so Bromley is working for Toftoy, and he is the guy that's putting together this package of missiles to send to the to White Sands for American study, and that of course violates the agreement between the U.S. and the British under the CIOS team. So the British witnesses to Bromley's Blitz operation were CIOS Team 163, led by William Cook, Dr. Alwyn Crow's deputy from the projectile development team, and John L. Stubb, a frustrated British pioneer of liquid-fueled rockets. Their mutual wartime antagonism disappeared when they became aware of the daunting scale of rocket production inside the mountain. Both arrived in Nordhausen 4 days after its liberation, 4 vital days during which Staver and Bromley had established themselves. For Elstub, as for everyone else, the first overwhelming impression was of, quote, the indescribable stench and evidence of inhumanity. I was most shocked how the head of the administration proved the accuracy of his calculation that the most cost-effective use of slave workers was to keep them alive for just 6 months, unquote. Accompanying them as they toured the production lines were the engineers who had not joined Von Braun. Before Elstub and Cook left, many quietly asked them whether there was a chance of continuing their work in Britain. The Britons could give no reply. They left, however, with boxes of valuable components packed onto a truck by an American expert, Edwin Hull, a General Electric employee. Okay. General Electric. We never saw that lorry again, grumbled Elstub 40 years later. Hull just shipped it straight back to the U.S. I felt sour that the bird had flown, unquote. It was the Brightons' first taste of knife-edged competition between the Allies. Staver had taken one glance at Cook and instantly distrusted him. Quote, he gave me a fish-eyed look when I asked him what he'd found. The habitual reserve of the Englishmen seemed sinister to the more extroverted Americans, especially to Toftoy's cowboys. While Cook traveled to Bavaria to question von Braun, Elstub returned to London, keenly aware that British rocketry needed hefty political and military support. The prospects for a British rocket program seemed hopeful. After all, London had just suffered a year's rocket bombardment. At that moment, von Braun was equally available to the Americans and the British. Indeed, had the British possessed the same resolution about rocket technology as they were showing at that same moment in Hamburg and Kiel about submarine warfare, there would have been little opportunity for Project Hermes, the American plan for achieving missile expertise, to have achieved such instant success. But British experts were, despite the overwhelming evidence of the success of liquid-fueled missiles, still obsessed with solid fuel. Crucially, in Britain, unlike America, none of the 3 military services sought missiles for their armory, while civil servants lacked both the information and the foresight to appreciate their true importance. Almost before it started, Britain was set to lose the missile race. Pardon me. Throughout the long and bitter wartime arguments in London about whether the Germans had succeeded in building an effective rocket, Alwyn Crow's damning skepticism had undoubtedly been at least partly due to his own failure to construct or even design a rocket with a diameter of more than 4 inches. Admittedly, solid fuel rockets had successfully been fired against the Luftwaffe and submarines, but in Britain they were regarded as a new type of shell rather than a completely new science. Lacking vision and of only limited ability, Crow had stolidly obstructed any investigation into liquid fuels capable of powering a large rocket, and without the imagination to become excited about the German discoveries, he soured others' interest. Crow's indelible legacy was to leave the British government without a senior informed expert on missiles. There was no British equivalent of Toftoy, eager to embrace and develop the new weapons within his own service. All right, I'm going to skip a few paragraphs to page 119. Both von Braun and Kurt Debus, Debus, the small dynamic rocket launch expert, reluctantly admitted that they had joined the SS in 1940. Understandably, Debus did not mention that at Peenemünde he was often to be seen wearing his SS uniform, and that in 1942 he had denounced to the Gestapo as an anti-Nazi a colleague who did not share Debus's view that the British started the war and who disputed the merits of Mein Kampf. Debus's denunciation resulted in his colleague's arrest and conviction by a special court. With considerable charm, both he and von Braun explained that they had reluctantly bowed to intolerable pressure and that their party membership was purely symbolic. The American interrogators were skeptical, and about Dornberger, their skepticism was positively vehement. He should be interned, scribbled the interrogator, as a menace to the security of the Allied forces. He is a technical member of the German General Staff with extreme views on German domination and wishes for Third World War, etc. The idea of wishing for a Third World War in 1945 is kind of creepy, isn't it? As for Rudolph, the interrogator's note read, quote, 100% Nazi, dangerous type, security threat, had to leave SA in 1934 when entered Waffenamt, suggest internment. When asked whether he had anything to do with slave labor at Nordhausen, Rudolph emphatically denied any responsibility or knowledge. Having made their recommendations, the interrogators departed. Under occupation laws agreed upon by the Allies, every former SS officer and active Nazi was automatically to be arrested, pending investigation. Loath to antagonize the scientists, Colonel Trichel of Army Ordnance decided that their temporary imprisonment, albeit in the comfort of Garmisch-Partenkirchen in Bavaria, satisfied the regulations. Meanwhile, in Paris, Staver composed a message for Toftoy recommending that the rocket team be offered short-term contracts and brought to America for further interrogation. His cable to the chief of ordnance in Washington was enthusiastic and in part dishonest. He claimed that U.S. forces were holding more than 400 top rocket scientists whose, quote, thinking is 25 years ahead of the U.S., unquote, and urged that the top 100 scientists be evacuated to America, where they could complete the drawings of the Wasserfall anti-aircraft missile within 3 months, and shortly afterward put into production for use against the Japanese. Staver knew that the timetable was impossible, but felt he had to offer senior officers in the Pentagon the bait of some immediate benefit. Staver also suggested that the scientists' recruitment would deny, quote, whole or part of this group to other interested agencies, unquote. To lend color to the threat of competition, Staver added that Russian agents had set up loudspeakers along the river Elbe and were broadcasting enticements to German scientists. This fanciful and naive fabrication was probably the invention of one of the scientists keen to improve his chances of immigration to the United States. But in the chaos of the German collapse, Staver was working unsupervised and uncontrolled, with unlimited enthusiasm and apparently unlimited power. Finally, knowing that officers antagonistic to recruiting Nazis would oppose the proposal on principle, Staver ended the message with an intentionally deceptive flourish, quote, future scientific importance outweighs their present war guilt, unquote. Staver never believed that any of the rocket scientists were tainted by war crimes. This parting shot was simply an astute device to, quote, smooth the idea and mitigate the inevitable perception in Washington that the Germans were war criminals. In Washington, Toftoy milled over Staver's cable and Bromley's reports from Nordhausen. Thousands of crates of blueprints and unassembled V-2s were crossing the Atlantic, and the only people who could assemble the rockets were the German designers. U.S. Army newsreel film had already shown a beaming von Braun with his arm in plaster, standing outside a whitewashed house surrounded by his friends Axter, Dornberger, and Debus. All were laughing. Toftoy's immediate problem was not only his colleagues' antipathy toward Germans, but their conviction that the threat of another war was remote. Nevertheless, both politicians and officials at the War Department were by then anxious to grasp at anything that might shorten the war in Japan, and Staver had offered a temporary expedient. The only likely obstacle was the State Department, especially the visa section, whose permission for entry into the United States was required by law. Now we're getting into some interesting questions when it comes to 5, 6, 7 years later, when McDuff comes in possession of these 68,000 files from J. Edgar Hoover, um, applications for what? Applications, I say, for visas for their paper-clipped Nazis. Howard Travers, a visa section official, had already become aware of the problem in March. Representatives from the chemical industry had discreetly inquired about the possibility of recruiting German experts. Chemical industry, DuPont, maybe, yeah, could be DuPont, yeah, maybe so. Had discreetly inquired about the possibility of recruiting German experts whose knowledge was undoubtedly the most advanced in the world. Travers was aghast at the project, interpreting the suggestion of such recruitment as a surreptitious attempt to place Nazi intelligence agents in America. What? Where did you get that idea, Travers? Really? A surreptitious attempt to place Nazi intelligence agents in America in 1945. Hmm. We should do everything we consistently can to prevent German chemists and others from entering this country, he said. Other officials, as yet unaware of the horror of Nazi atrocities, were not alarmed. Cogently, Kermit Gordon, another State Department official, presented the national defense argument in favor of admitting the Germans. Quote, the remarkable achievements of German science before and during the present war were largely responsible for Germany's achievement of a degree of military power entirely out of relation to her population and raw material position, unquote. Do you believe that? No. What was responsible for all of it was the money that came from the financiers and the capitalists and the military industrial complex. That's what made the miracle in Germany. If they hadn't had the money, they would have never done the science. Again, these are my comments. But I'm becoming more and more convinced that the wars of the 20th century were simply wars in order to increase the ability of the corporate powers behind the scenes to control all of us, to control humanity, and to do that by any means necessary. And they're getting closer, aren't they? Gordon argued that if the Allies attempted to ban scientific research, history would repeat itself. In 1918, German scientists had fled to neighboring countries to continue their work and returned fully equipped to launch Nazi Germany's armaments industry. Quote, the main purpose of encouraging their immigration to the United States would be to assure that they shall not work in this field for another power. The memorandum suggested that the scientists were mostly politically passive and could safely be admitted to America, where it would be possible in time to alienate their loyalties to Germany and assimilate them to the American community. Isn't that nice? It seemed that the State Department would offer no barrier to any reasonable request by the military, which had, after all, made enormous sacrifices for the nation and was still committed to a war of attrition in the Far East. The military, on the other hand, was for the most part in a state of confusion. On May 15th, the same day Eisenhower urged the War Department to send him a cable stating its policy about the future treatment of German science, General Brehon Somervell, what a great name that is, Brehon, Brehon, like the Irish judges from the old days, the Brehons, and the last name is Somervell, asked the chief of staff in the War Department to sanction the admission of 38 German scientists. Remarkably, all of them were either theoretical scientists or ship designers. Not one of them could be of any immediate use in the war with Japan. Over the following 2 weeks, most sections of the War Department and the Army acted in a thoroughly confused and uncertain manner, leaving Somerville's request unanswered. As far as the rocket scientists were concerned, however, Army intelligence, or G2, knew what it wanted. Major General Clayton Bissell, that's yes, Bissell. No notice, I'm not able to see any direct connection to our nemesis, Richard Bissell, but, it's the same name, and the Bissell name, comes out of New England from the days of the Puritans. I think it goes that far. So many branches of the Bissell family. This one is a Major General Clayton Bissell, Assistant Chief of Staff, destined in later years for an intriguing career in the CIA, in parentheses, adopted a more subtle approach than Somerville. On his orders, on May 22nd, two colonels visited Frederick Lyon, an assistant secretary at the State Department, and politely informed him that G2 intended to bring 40 rocket scientists into America under military custody as a matter of urgency. Since they would technically be under arrest, State Department approval for visas was legally unnecessary. G2, Lyon was told, had heard that German rocket blueprints had been passed to the Japanese, and it was vital that the Germans be interrogated by experts. Bissell's ruse seduced Lyon into believing that the Germans would be returned within 4 to 6 weeks. Quote, one can readily appreciate the necessity of having these men work here for a temporary period, unquote, wrote the beguiled official. It was the first of many lies the Army would tell the State Department. 4 days later, Bissell received a detailed proposal from the Chief of Military Intelligence for 2 sites able to accommodate 50 to 100 German scientists. For the moment, it was relatively uncomplicated to bring the scientists to America without formally consulting the State and Justice Departments. But military intelligence still felt concerned about avoiding, quote, promiscuous travel by the scientists, which would arouse, quote, unfavorable publicity and inevitably cause problems. Indeed, an outbreak of public fury was the politicians' greatest fear. On May 28th, Robert Patterson, the Undersecretary of War, approved Trischel's plan based on Staver's recommendations, agreeing that every possible aid should be used in the war against Japan. But his letter reflected the politician's sensitivity to considerations that the military had apparently ignored. Quote, "These men are enemies, and it must be assumed that they are capable of sabotaging our war effort. Bringing them to this country raises delicate questions, including the possible strong resentment of the American public." Unquote. Let's skip a couple paragraphs here. Trishelle had in fact anticipated approval of the plan. On June the 1st, Staver began to select a group of rocket technicians, rather than theorists, who would be given 6-month contracts to work in America provided they were willing to cooperate. During their absence, their dependents in Germany would enjoy privileged conditions. With fervent zeal, an American ordnance group led by Staver and Porter, with active help from von Braun, began scouring the Bleicherode area in search of the remaining Peenemünde and Nordhausen evacuees. Dozens of vehicles were requisitioned, and officers with lists of names and addresses drove through the area amid the post-war chaos, delivering the simple message: either accept immediate evacuation or remain at your peril in the future Soviet zone. Unquote. Ernst Stühlinger, an important theoretician, was among those given a few hours' warning. An American captain came and told me to leave Thuringia by midnight. I told him that I had no transport. He said, "Just take the mayor's car. From tomorrow, he won't need it." Others left in a massive convoy. Only 20 hours before Russian troops were expected to arrive on June 20th, a train carrying 1,000 scientists and their families crossed the river Wera into the American zone. Many scientists decided not to leave their homes, and later Porter was insistent that, quote, "we used no threats or force of any kind." Subsequent investigations would prove otherwise. As ordnance officers and Porter patiently started negotiations with the Germans in Garmisch-Partenkirchen about their terms of employment in America, some State Department officials began voicing their doubts about the apparently unquestioning support that Kermit Gordon had promised in April. The focus of their anger was William Clayton, an assistant secretary at the State Department, who had drafted a letter to John McCloy. You remember John McCloy, right? He's a Rockefeller man. The Assistant Secretary of War, supporting the admission of the Germans, quote, "in the national interest," unquote, since otherwise they would, quote, "find their way to other countries," unquote. Clayton's letter was not sent. At Clattenburg, in the department's Special War Problems Division, Al Clattenburg, the person's named Al Clattenburg, objected because it seemingly allowed the Germans into America without any restrictions, either on the scientists or on the army itself. His objection triggered a major departmental meeting to review policy on June 27th. Officials arrived in the conference room, nursing a variety of irreconcilable interests, passions, and grievances. Throughout the war, the department had been split on numerous issues, but on none more so than the treatment of the Jews, and specifically the admission to America of Jewish refugees from Europe. Subsequent investigation proved that senior State Department officials had deliberately played down and even suppressed eyewitness reports of Nazi persecution in order to resist the pressure for more Jewish immigration. Irate officials, especially the handful like Seymour Rubin, who were Jewish, were moved by the daily war exposure of German atrocities to atone for their colleagues' suppression of the truth. Reading through Gordon's presentation, they were uneasy about his assumption that the scientists were, quote, politically passive, unquote. They were simply no longer prepared to tolerate the presence of any German in the American hemisphere who had collaborated with the Nazis during the war. Within weeks, there would be a clear schism between pro-Jewish and other officials. But for the moment, those arguing against the military's proposals rested their case on less emotive grounds. Throughout the War Department, officials had been concerned about the pro-German bias of the, quote, neutral South American states, especially Argentina. American security, it was felt, had been threatened by Germans developing new weapons in the neutral countries for Hitler's benefit. At the State Department meeting, the anti-scientist faction argued that the United States should now convince the South Americans to repatriate those, quote, dangerous individuals, unquote, to Europe, where they would be imprisoned with other pro-Nazis while their future was considered. Agreement proved impossible, and the meeting ended in acrimony, leaving the department without any policy. It's the State Department, 1945. With the State Department in disarray, the Joint Chiefs and McCloy came under pressure from impatient officers to approve their plan of bringing the Germans over under military custody as prisoners of war. By late June, the criteria for admitting the Germans had been agreed upon and seemed to those with political sensitivities to be sufficiently strict. Only an, quote, essential minimum, unquote, of, quote, indispensable, unquote, volunteers, none of them suspected war criminals, were to be temporarily, quote unquote, transferred to Fort Strong on an island near Boston, where they would be held for interrogation. A War Department study conducted by Major General Gladian Barnes, in charge of the Ordnance Technical Division, stipulated that, quote, only the most compelling argument should bring a German specialist to this country for interrogation. It must be emphasized that this procedure is in effect a form of exploitation of chosen rare minds whose continued intellectual productivity we wish to use, unquote. Chosen rare minds. Rare is a good thing in this case, is it not? As Bissell noted, the essential criterion was their, quote, indispensability to the successful accomplishment of the most vital research program, period, unquote. The most vital research program. What was the most vital research program? Rockets? Missiles? Something unmentioned, perhaps? Perhaps something that has to do with biological, chemical? Yeah, the most vital program. Which one is it? Doesn't say. On July 5th, Toftoy was told that his plan had been approved. Brusquely, the British chiefs were informed that since the scientists' exploitation was only a temporary priority matter, further discussions were unnecessary and British cooperation was desired and expected. The exploitation program was officially sanctioned on July 19th by the Joint Chiefs of Staff as, quote, Operation Overcast, unquote, allowing 350 German scientists, without their families, to be brought to the United States on 6-month contracts that could be renewed for another 6 months. Ordnance was allowed to bring in 100 rocket scientists, and von Braun's team was expected to arrive within 6 weeks. Only 6 weeks earlier, Bissell's emissaries to the State Department had told Assistant Secretary Lyon that the limit would be 40. Soon after, Toftoy, who had now taken over the selection of the scientists from Trichel, arrived in Witzenhausen to begin choosing the best scientists and negotiating their contracts. Asked to explain how taking German scientists to America for war research was compatible with the Joint Chiefs' directive to Eisenhower expressly forbidding any dealings with ex-Nazis, Toftoy claimed that he was acting on superior orders from the president. Wow, isn't that interesting? It's kind of like J. Edgar Hoover also had a kind of a side understanding with Roosevelt, on which, he based his exclusive claim to counterintelligence in the Western Hemisphere, which is why the FBI was all over South America and Central America and Mexico. And that, of course, was the era in which the CIA started recruiting FBI agents and taking over FBI territory. All this happening during McDuff's career. Despite the Joint Chiefs limitation, he listed 115 names. Von Braun was offered $750 a month, the others commensurate salaries. While the Germans seemed impressed by the high rate of pay, they were all worried about leaving their families behind in Germany. Although they would be housed and protected by the army in a special compound where they would receive substantial privileges, Toftoy tried to allay their fears, but other American agencies suspected that the family's issue was a smokescreen concealing a more crucial question. Colonel Ralph Osborne, a scientist and chief of Fiat, that's FIAT, less enthusiastic about the Germans than Toftoy, was convinced that the Germans, quote, were running rings around the Americans, unquote. By mid September, clear evidence had emerged of von Braun's devious schemes. Three Peenemünde scientists, all anti-Nazis who had refused American contracts, confided to Osborne that the rocket team's strict hierarchical structure under Dornberger, Axter, and von Braun had remained intact despite the German surrender. Before every interrogation, each German was carefully briefed by the triumvirate and their lieutenants about what could and could not be disclosed. The guidelines were explicit: divulge no more than required to arouse technical and scientific curiosity, and avoid going into technical detail that would render employment by the Americans unnecessary. Whenever pressed, the Germans were either to plead the absence of documentary material, or refer questions to other members of the team, in order to create the impression that a larger number of scientists were, quote, indispensable, unquote. After every interrogation, each German was debriefed in the presence of his colleagues so that the others knew precisely what was the Americans' current state of knowledge. Osborne, Osborne also discovered that those scientists who criticized or failed to obey Dornberger's edicts were punished. Toftoy breezily dismissed Osborne's findings, including evidence that the triumvirate was deciding who should or should not be allowed to accept American contracts. Excluded were those scientists, regardless of qualifications, who had rebelled against this clique's authority. Indeed, included were the faithful, despite lack of scientific expertise, among them the group's artist, Gerd de Beek, as well as von Braun's chauffeur and Axter. While Toftoy was patiently trying to persuade the Germans to accept his terms, Crow successfully argued that the British had the right to question the team before it left for America. After all, the British were equal partners and also had the right to develop rockets. Indeed, other than the obstacle of Britain's financial predicament, there was no reason the British should not take the lead in the European rocket development. Reluctantly, Toftoy agreed. Von Braun, Dornberger, Axter, and others were flown to Inkpot, the Beltane School in Wimbledon. Beltane is another Celtic reference, isn't it? In Wimbledon, requisitioned as an internment camp for scientists. Crow wanted their advice about how to establish a British rocket center and and fire a series of V2s in Cuxhaven. Von Braun claims that his team, probably with Toftoy's encouragement, was polite but deliberately unhelpful. In fact, Crow put no great pressure on the Germans to be otherwise. In July 1945, British rocket policy was still in astonishing confusion. In the end, von Braun was flown back to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, while Dornberger and Debus were taken directly to Cuxhaven, the desolate site on the coast of the North Sea, where 500 Germans and 1,500 military personnel were already building a brand new V2 assembly plant and launching pad. Rudolph and about 80 others from the team had already arrived. Operation Backfire had been informally approved by Eisenhower on May 10th. Major General Alexander Cameron, then Chief of Schaeff's Air Defense Division, and his staff had convinced both Eisenhower and the War Office that the British should test fire a series of V2s for experimental purposes. Crow concurred. Squads of interrogators and investigators from the 21st Army were dispatched throughout Europe to collect and assemble the equipment and German personnel. Dozens of trains and hundreds of planes brought the equipment to Cuxhaven, where new roads and railway lines were being laid and huge assembly sheds erected. With Eisenhower's personal support, the enormous cost and vast resources needed for Operation Backfire seemed to be the prelude to a British breakthrough. The U.S. War Department was skeptical about the idea and strongly protested Eisenhower's freeze on shipping V2s to White Sands. The British, it seemed, were more interested in learning how to fire a rocket than masterminding the scientific knowledge to build one. Curiously, London had asked Eisenhower's headquarters to send just 4 V2 rockets to Britain, while Washington wanted 100. The British had abruptly increased their request to match the Americans, but their initial modesty was interpreted by the Pentagon as proof that the British would not seriously contest their control over the von Braun team. Proprietary about, quote, my Germans, unquote, Toftoy was furious about the British operation. He felt that the British were deliberately scuttling Operation Overcast and demanded the immediate return of 26 of the Peenemünde experts, claiming that they were vital for the Japanese war. To his relief, the British were cooperative, indeed quite conciliatory. 14 of the scientists and technicians were released immediately, and the return of the remainder was promised after the firings. The British deputy chiefs had already decided that, because of their heavily reduced defense budget, rocket development would be limited to LOP-GAP, an anti-aircraft missile smaller than the V2. For the Germans, Operation Backfire lived up to its unfortunate code name. It furnished ample proof that the British could not offer an attractive future. Rudolph expressed his contempt for British amateurism, and in Washington, the operation was ignored. On their return to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Rudolph and his colleagues discovered that von Braun and a small advance team had left for America in early September. They had flown from France to Wilmington, Delaware, and then via the Aberdeen Proving Ground to El Paso, Texas, where they arrived by the end of the month. Over the next 3 months, 118 of the Peenemünde group arrived in Texas. They were well looked after. For a 48-hour week, they were paid $6 per day, tax-free, with free medical care, sick leave, accommodation, and food. There were no checks to discover whether any of those selected were ardent Nazis or war criminals. The checks, concedes Steve Staver, were crude. Looking down the list of arrivals, others would say they were non-existent. Only Walter Dornberger failed to arrive in America as planned. During the preparations for Operation Backfire, he had been flown to London, ostensibly for consultations, but instead he was taken to the London Cage, an interrogation center for suspected war criminals. Politicians wanted a scapegoat for the bombardment of London. Toftoy was outraged. All his suspicions of British perfidy were confirmed. Dornberger, he thundered, was needed in America. Dr. Howard Robertson, chief advisor to Osborne, the head of Fiat, disagreed. Quote, Dornberger is a regular soldier of 30 years' service, is not a first rate technician, and wields great power over his subordinates, including Professor von Braun. I am convinced that Dornberger is a most dangerous man, and that he should not in any case be shorn of all influence over, and that he should in any case be shorn of all influence over and even prevented to have contact with his former Peenemünde subordinates. Unquote. For the next 2 years, Dornberger was held with other high ranking Nazis at Bridgend, Bridgend, I guess Bridgend, in Wales, but he was neither charged nor interrogated about the V2. In Cook's words, quote, Dornberger was the SS's man. He knew nothing about rockets, unquote. Washington felt differently. When he was eventually released, Dornberger was flown directly to Texas, where he was accorded a hero's welcome. Pardon me. Well, we just got to the end of our chapter, and perhaps that's a good place for me to stop. It's page 130. The next chapter is competition and confusion, and we get a lot more out of Major General Clayton Bissell. The Russians appear in the next chapter, and how they got all of their guys out of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute before the Americans could get there. A lot of more interesting names are going to come up in chapter 7 when we get to it, but I think I'll leave that for next time. Thank you all very, very much. What I'm seeing here is again the corporate monsters of the 19th century that were created, in places like Cleveland. Are pulling the shots, pulling the levers, running the show behind the scenes, and have absolutely no moral character whatsoever. And that's the way I see it. That's where America has got to get back its soul, its heart. We've got to have a spiritually sound country, and we don't. We're letting in these people who calculate the exact amount of months to keep a slave alive to get the most work out of him. That's what we're dealing with. All right. Thank you very much. I'll see you guys tomorrow with Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche organization. Always a fun and interesting conversation. So please join us then. And thanks for supporting us on Patreon. It's Patreon/John O'Loughlin.